Hi, hello, my name is Robin, and today I'm doing a birthday scene for none other than Lazy Masquerade. Whenever you start a project, it's very smart that you block it out, so you're not wasting your time, and you have a general idea for what you're doing. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm using some mega scans, which are free, and awesome. There is no shame in using what's free. I'm using these figurines to block out the characters that I want in the shot, and I'm just very roughly posing them. Luckily for me, I already had an idea for what I wanted. And that was something similar from the video game Resident Evil 7. There's a dinner scene in the game, which is pretty gross, and I was very inspired by that as I played it and shit myself. This guy right here isn't necessarily something that I sculpted, it's actually something that I bought off of ArtStation. The only thing I sculpted on this is the clothing, and I cleaned up the typology, so it was a lot easier to rig and pose. And for the rigging, I'm using IK Max for Cinema 4D. You can now see me on screen repainting the weight map. After I finished up in Zbrush, I hopped right on over to Substance Painter, so I could texture paint this monster. Usually when I texture paint models, I tend to spend hours on a project. But for this, I didn't really feel like I had to. I just wanted some simple skin color and some grunge and some blood. That's all it needed. Because I wasn't gonna take the camera up close and have any close-up renders of it, so I didn't really care. It was just gonna be an asset a little further from the camera. Right. I sped it up a little, so now we can see me paint on the blood, cuts and wounds, some bruising, yeah, just some tiny little stuff like that. Like I said, it's not a super refined paint job, because the character is so far away. And now I'm doing the clothing, like adding a lot of dirt and blood. And right now I'm adding some color variations to the skin. One skin color is not just one color. It's variations of multiple colors. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm blending in a lot of blue and yellow and orange. I'm using this picture right here as reference on how to paint skin color. It is the same technique as if you were to paint this on a canvas using oil paint. Just blend your colors and your skin tones will look more natural. Now this, by all means, is no masterclass on how to texture paint. This is definitely one of the more sloppier paint jobs that I've done, but it works out. The end results, it works. And for the skull, I had some issues UV mapping, so I just decided to do it all in Cinema 4D using Octane. And when I was done with all that, I hopped right back into Zbrush to sculpt the cake. The cake mesh was very easy to make. It was made with 3 cylinders stacked up on each other and Dynamesh together, and then I used a clay build-up brush and just carved it in. And not only did I use a clay brush, but I also used like a mountain and rock brush to add the texture for it. I thought it worked out pretty good, so I just kept that. And since I wanted the cake to be very decayed, I decided to put worms in the cake, make it look all gross. The worms, once again, was made by a cylinder. It was smoothed out, bent and twisted, and just hand placed around. And the candle, believe it or not, was made by a cylinder. Yeah, just cylinders. And I just used a wax brush that I had bought off of ArtStation. And then I had to texture paint the cake. So what I did for the cake is that I made several folders. One folder was for the outside of the cake, the white frosting. And I made another folder for the inside of the cake that was masked out. The frosting on the cake was made with a smear texture and was pumped into the height channel, and then I used some noise to break it up a little. And for the inside of the cake, it was made by multiple sets of noise stacked up on each other. And then I used generators like curvature and dirt to add variation in colors. I didn't have to do a lot of noise work in Substance Painter because a lot of the detail came out of Zbrush using the displacement map, or the normal map. And for a rotting decaying cake, I had to use a lot of green and grey. I also tried using a picture of moss to paint it onto the cake. And then there was the man himself. So for this character, I didn't do any work on the face because he was gonna have a mask. So in a way, he doesn't have a face, right? And you're probably thinking, how the hell did he eat cake with a mask on? Well, he took it off and then put the mask on after he ate the cake. Duh. And I painted the blood on to tell a different story. Like, they were eating dessert now, but previously they were eating dinner, and for dinner they ate something. And right now I'm modeling a plate for the cake. And then I started working on the cake pieces, which I made in a very strange way. I started with a cube and then I did a simulation and fractured it. And then I used the fracture and I put that into Zbrush, and then I started sculpting all of these pieces to make it look like clumps and crumbles of cake. And of course, more worms. So this time I made an insert brush because I want my worms. And now I'm using the insert brush to add the worms, and I'm just using the one worm. And then I will separate them with polygroups so I can move them around and just randomize them using the gizmo or the move brush. Congratulations. Truly. You, my friend, have worms in your cake. Bon appetit. And very late out in the process, I forgot, presents in this birthday party. So I just did that all in Zbrush and imported it into Cinema 4D. And now, finally, to the compositing. I started right away adding a lot more fingerprints to the glass. I already added some in Cinema 4D, but I felt like it wasn't very visible, so I wanted to add a little more of that. It was very subtle, but the more subtleties you put into a piece, the closer you are to achieve realism, photorealism. Life is just full of subtleties and details. And right now I'm just photoshopping in some elements that I didn't build. It's kind of just easier to just Photoshop it in. And I don't think any 3D artist should be too hard on themselves for not building their own assets. Let's say you buy a model, or you decide to Photoshop it in later. Like, there is no shame in doing that. It all depends on the end result. It doesn't matter if you built it, or bought it, or composited it in. The only thing that matters is the end result. And there will be projects that the end result doesn't really matter, but rather how much you learn from doing a project. That's what I do all the time. I start a project just so I can learn something new. And 60% of the time, I don't even give a shit about the end result. And by working like this, you've gained so much more knowledge, you are more wiser for the future, you've extended your tool belt, you are a smarter person. Good on ya. A lot of people would pay a lot of money for knowledge. The truth is, you're just gonna have to sit down, start projects, fail a lot, and do everything you can to serve the end result, the end product. Now, I'm not a 3D master by any means, but just some advice. Sorry for that short little TED talk. Right now, I am adding back some texture to the inside of the cake, because I felt it didn't really look right, so I'm just photoshopping it. You would be forgiven to think that this was just meat that I was photoshopping in, but it's actually a photo of the inside of the cake, and I'm just painting that back in, and I'm gonna be messing with the blending modes to make sure it looks right. If you're new to compositing, then you have probably no idea what you're looking at right now. This is a material ID. It gives out a color for every single material there is in the scene, the render. So now I'm just picking the color for the worms, so I could shift the colors with a hue and saturation. This would be a nightmare to mask out by hand. Ugh. Hey, you know what? It's not enough worms, so I put in a lot more worms. I ended up doing a lot of Photoshop. I think I spent maybe 2 hours on this thing. So there's a lot of footage, so I'm gonna speed it all up and maybe talk about some of the stuff that I did, but And so right now I'm just working off of the material ID, selecting some of the objects and just making them look a little more prettier. And since I rendered out ambient occlusion, I just painted back in some contact shadows. And for this guy, I wasn't too happy with the texture, so I grabbed some grunge and I painted the back in, used the blend modes, and then I painted on some blood. And the same for this guy, but minus the blood. Like I said, I'm just adding more subtleties. And since I'm not the best guy to sculpt hands, the fingers were a little messed up, so I just took a photo of a finger and just photoshopped on his hand. It bothered me. And then very late on I decided to add birthday hats. The birthday hats were all elements from Envato Elements. It's a great site to get stock images or just elements for compositing. It's pretty good, I love it. And obviously these hats looked very flat and lit completely differently, so I had to do some fake lighting and then add the contact shadows, which was a lot harder than it looked. Just didn't look right. And something that I was always too scared to do was to grab the Photoshop brush and to paint in effects like I did on this table. I'd be too scared because I know I'm not a good painter, so I'd just use images of blood, for example. And some advice if you are doing compositing. Just grab a ton of Photoshop brushes. It could be blood, smoke, spider webs, slime, whatever. Like, you can find it all. And that's what I've started doing. I don't even Google stuff anymore, I just use the brushes. It's great. And something that I do for all my projects is I go into Camera Raw, bump up the clarity all the way up, and I'll put it on the blending mode on screen or lighten, and I'll paint in on the highlights. Just adds a lot nicer, sharper highlights. And whenever I do paint, I use a very low flow. And I use Camera Raw a lot for compositing. I'll tweak a bunch of colors and I'll paint in where I want these colors. It could be a different temperature, like a lot warmer coming from the fireplace, and then maybe cooler in the foreground. I'll do all of that in Camera Raw and then paint it in. And that pretty much sums it all up. Now I'm just doing a lot more color grading, putting some LUTs on it, making it all look very cool. Well, if you made it this far, well, to the end, then I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something. Now go out there and be creative, little one. I'll see you around. Peace.